I am Bo Case. I am Dean of University Libraries and Director of the University Press at the University of Toledo. I am really excited to be here. Early on, Ted and I met for altogether another reason, but then I learned about his C-SPAN channel of stories about Toledo, and I was really impressed with his knowledge. The quality of videos is very good, and of Toledo, that this is a special place. So I'm really happy that Ted decided to sign up with the press and put out this book. So Ted, as you know, is an author, photographer, tour guide, lecturer, and curator of HolyToledoHistory.com, with a wonderful blog with many other stories. So I will see if he would like to say a few things, and after that, I'll launch into some questions.
Thanks. I appreciate it, Bo. First, I want to thank everybody for being here. Like I said, I see lots of friends and family, and that's great. I also want to say thanks to all the veterans here on Veterans Day. I'm excited. It's been a year's worth of research and writing, and now finally comes to fruition with the book actually being in print, which was really a blast last week when Yarko showed up and handed it over. I was, dumbstruck to see it actually in print. It was so cool. So yeah. I'm looking forward to tonight and the whole launch.
Awesome. Yeah, and I watched you on social media, proudly holding up the book. It is a great feeling as an author, and also as a publisher, to see these come out and the impact that we have on the community. So Ted, I'm going to ask you some questions about the book. First one should be an easy one for you. Tell me about the book. What's in here?
Yeah, it's an interesting compilation, I guess. When you first see it in print, you look at that table of contents and you're like, oh, looks interesting. But for me, what I think was really interesting is when you see these photos of the faces of the people and the animals and the things that were visitors to Toledo. I think this image in itself tells a story in terms of the chronology of people in time, and then just the different areas that it touches. I mean, it's military history, great authors, gangsters, world records, the theater, and I love it at the end, rock and roll, with my story of Neil Young coming to Toledo. So when you think of just certain names, one thing I wanted to tell people right off, Yarko and I went round and round about whether or not Tecumseh and Little Turtle and Blue Chief were considered visitors. I mean, this was their land. But when you think about it in perspective of the book, they were visitors, in fact, because they didn't really live here. This was not, where they domiciled. They were out and about, but they visited here for certain reasons. And if you read the book, certainly you'll find out what that's all about. But the question I always get from people is, why did I write the book? What possessed you to write a book about forgotten visitors? And I hark back to a New York Times story that I read a while back about the Willard Dempsey fight. And it was actually, this was what's called a backstory column. And it talked about the fact that when the Willard Dempsey fight happened on July 4th, 1919, if you don't know the story, it was over 100 degrees and it was an incredible event for Toledo. But there were two people that attended that event. And in this piece that I wrote or read, it talked about Jack Dempsey walking into the ring to, prepare for this epic battle. And he looks out into the crowd and he sees Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson. taking guns and knives away from people in the crowd. And I was stunned. I was just like blown away. I mean, I had no idea Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson ever came to Toledo. But more than that, I mean, I never really thought that they were here at the same time in 1919. And I started to think about, who else came to Toledo? And it got swept under the rug. Who are the other forgotten visitors that were here? And that's kind of what started me on this whole idea of the book. The book itself was started when Yarko Cook, who's the managing editor of the Toledo Press, texted me after one of my blog pieces and said, "Have you ever thought about writing a book?" And I was like, I'd love to write a book, but I don't know what I would do it on. And then this idea of forgotten visitors started to come to me, and that's how you end up with this group of people that we talk about today is these forgotten visitors.
So which visitors in particular have interested you the most? I mean, these are all fantastic stories and images here.
There's a lot of different people. There's, I think, like 26 visitors in total. There's 23 stories, but there's a few that really jump out for me. I think the one that I find most interesting was Mark Twain. This book covers 225 years. And I tell people I'm the last person to tell you that I'm a historian. I'm more of a storyteller, but Twain really has a great story, a backstory to his visit in Toledo. He was really just getting his start. And by the way, this photo of him is what he looked like when he visited Toledo in 1869. He was really just getting his start. He had just kind of made it onto the American radar with his jumping, help me out here, the Calaveras County famous jumping frogs. And he was starting to kind of make his way with the idea of storytelling around a tour that he had just given or just done. And he spoke here at this site in Toledo, which is another fascinating story. This is White's Hall, and this was located at Summit and Oak. And Oak today is Jackson Street. So this is where 4 Seagate sits today. It's Summit and Jackson. And this was built in 1861. And you see on the front, it says Newhouse Brothers. Well, this building was actually built as a store for the Newhouse Brothers. They handled ladies' goods and home furnishings. And the 3rd floor was White's Hall. And that's where Mark Twain spoke when he came to Toledo in 1869. The story that, really kind of drives the whole concept behind the book, there's a backstory for every visit. And in the case of Mark Twain, the backstory was that he was just frightened by the idea of coming to Toledo. And that really intrigued me. And thankfully, he wrote a number of letters back to his fiance and some of his managers. And we were able to research and find those letters. This is one that he wrote from Toledo on January 20th of 1869. And this was back to his soon-to-be wife. And the part that you'll find most interesting is he says, "I knew this being Nasby's residence, every person in the audience would be comparing and contrasting me with him, and I'm satisfied with the performance." And this theme shows up in multiple letters that he was sending throughout this journal that he was writing on his trip across the Midwest. Toledo was the place he was most concerned about because he was coming to the home of Petroleum V. Nasby. And if you don't know about Nasby, he was a phenomenal figure at the time. He was probably the most popular writer in the United States at the time. His pen name was Petroleum V. Nasby, but his real name was David Ross Locke. He was born in New York, apprenticed at the age of 12 with a couple of different small papers in New York, eventually comes to Ohio. And I'm originally from Mansfield, and he was in the Richland County area first, and then came to Findlay, and then eventually came to Toledo and bought the Toledo Blade. And he made his name as this character, Petroleum V. Nasby, writing about the Civil War from a perspective of this outrageous Southerner who just couldn't see through, what the whole thing was all about. And so Twain, being, coming to Toledo, was very concerned that the Toledo audience was going to be a pretty hip audience and understand what storytelling was all about and what humor was all about. And so he was very worried. And it ended up, he wrote several letters where he said, I think I killed it. And if you read The Blade and a couple of the other newspapers at the time, and they're included in the book, they basically said he had the audience in total rapture. They were blown away by Twain. Eventually, Twain meets and becomes friends with Nasby or Ross Locke. And this is a photo of him actually about a year after his visit to Toledo. This is Twain in the center here, David Ross Locke on the left, and then this other gentleman is Josh Billings, that was his pen name. He was Wheeler Shaw. He was another humorist. And in the end, Twain is actually offered the opportunity to move to Toledo and write for the Toledo Blade by Nasby. He writes a letter to his mother, kind of wringing his hands about the decision, and decides not to do it. All that's tied up in the book, and one of my favorite stories in the whole book. The other couple stories I'll just touch on briefly that I thought were really fascinating were...
Yeah, it's a great photo.
This is Harry Houdini hanging from the Valentine Theater in Toledo. And believe it or not, this wasn't his show. This was his tease to sell tickets. When he would come to different cities, he would put on these exhibits to sell tickets for the real show. And in this particular case, they hung him upside down, chained him up, and he escapes while people sit on the streets looking up at this outrageous event taking place in downtown Toledo on the streets. Houdini came to Toledo many times. He was actually here early, very early in his career. He actually was here with his brother right after the Chicago World's Fair. They came to Toledo and mesmerized everybody with his performance. And then he came back here multiple times. And the best part for me in the Houdini story is his unpublished biography was based on his journals. And he claimed that his most difficult stunt ever was performed in Toledo. He was actually brought on stage at the Valentine and was welded inside of a boiler by workers from the Toledo Boiler Company. And it took him 90 minutes to escape. And he went back to his hotel that night and wrote in his journal, I love this, he said, I got to find another way to end my performance because this is killing me. And he said, this by far tonight was the most outrageous performance I've ever given. And that was in Toledo. So I thought that was a cool story. And then lastly, I think one of my favorites is the story of Wrong Way Corrigan. This is a guy who he touches my heart because he was just so persistent and he never gave up about what he wanted to accomplish. And he was just a fun, interesting fellow. I mean, he just had, when you read about him, you want to meet him. And so the story there is essentially he's known as Wrong Way Corrigan because he was supposed to fly cross country from New York to California, and he took a wrong way and ended up in Ireland in an airplane just a few years after Lindbergh. And he returned and had probably a bigger ticker tape parade than Lindbergh did in New York. And 2 weeks later, goes on a barnstorming deal and lands in Toledo. And I tell a story about his trip to Toledo. So those were probably my three favorites. All of them are, I'm fond of all of them. I've learned to love a number of these characters, and I'm learning more and more about them all the time. But those are my two favorites.
Twain must have liked it here because he didn't say something bad about us like San Francisco in that coldest summer ever spent was there. So what accounts for all the visitors? Rail? Looking at your map here.
It's a good question. And I put this map up because that was one of the things I learned from the book, doing the research for the book. Quite a number of these visitors just couldn't avoid Toledo. If you were coming across the country for a book tour or whatever it might be, theater, you were going to come through Toledo. Toledo was second to Chicago in the number of rail lines coming into the city. And it's one of the reasons people always ask, why did Dempsey and Willard have their fight in Toledo? Well, the first issue was Toledo was pretty loose at the time, and they were willing to actually host the fight. Most places weren't. But the second reason was Toledo was a place where most anybody in the country could get to it because of all the rail lines coming in. So that was one of the things that I learned from the research in the book, was this fantastic transportation network that cuts through Toledo. And if you think about how Lake Erie kind of cuts in between Toledo and Detroit, it's kind of unavoidable if you're going from Detroit to New York, or Detroit to Pittsburgh, or Chicago to New York, you're going to come through Toledo. So that was one of the other things that I learned about my community when I did that. Wrote the book. The other thing was, I mentioned earlier about Twain speaking at White's Hall. I also found out that before 1871, Toledo was really a city of halls. There was no big venue when someone came to town. There were these halls sprinkled all over the place. There was Union Hall, Hunker's Hall, Clark's Hall, Morris Hall, Stickney Hall, White's Hall, where Twain spoke. And that's this building here, 1869. And then in 1871, they built the Wheeler Opera House. And it was a very opulent, beautiful venue. And I go into great detail about that when I talk about Sarah Bernhardt and her visit to Toledo. And unfortunately, that burned down. And in 1895, the Valentine Theater was built. And that became the next great venue for Toledo. And that's close to my heart. I'm past president of the Valentine board and have had a lot of great experiences there. But it was a surprise to me to find out that, it really wasn't a surprise. I mean, Toledo was just a growing, spot on the Maumee River at the time. And you wouldn't expect them to instantly have this great venue. But it was interesting to me how many halls there were and how many different people spoke there. And in doing the research, I've come up with a whole other notebook of other forgotten visitors that spoke in those halls. And I hope to come back to that someday and do a follow-up to this book.
So I have a couple more questions for you, but I encourage everyone to use the chat feature in Zoom. You can drop questions in there, and at the end, we'll have Ted field them. So we moved on to another slide here, but I was going to ask you what surprised you the most?
Yeah, well, this one is my favorite surprise, actually. Like I said, I don't consider myself an historian. I'm more of a storyteller, but I did a lot of research for this book and spent a lot of time at the local history department at the Toledo Public Library. And those people were great to work with, kind of surfing through microfilm of old newspapers and old books. And on the internet, though, I stumbled onto this article, which was Christmas in Urania. And I was dumbfounded because basically it was a story of Sarah Bernhardt and her first trip to Toledo. And this book, or this article, actually appeared in the 1984 edition of the Chronicle, which is the magazine of the Historical Society of the state of Michigan. And then the author, Evan Garrett, basically tells the story of Sarah Bernhardt and her first trip to Toledo and how she snuck out of town on her private Pullman car to Ann Arbor to give a private performance, and she got snowed in. And literally the snow covered the car, and she spent Christmas just outside of Ann Arbor off US 23 until a train from Toledo came out. People dug her out, and she made her way into Toledo, and she performed in Toledo the following day. And it was just a great story. I mean, it was fascinating. And I did pull together all the information, put it into the book. And I got to admit that just weeks before this was going to get published, Yarko called and said, hey, we're having trouble finding some photos of Bernhardt. And I don't know what it was. It was literally like 8 o'clock at night. I was like, I'm gonna go check that again. And I went up and I started to check the dates and the times of this wonderful piece that I thought was going to make the book. And I found out that it was all a fantasy. It was absolute lies. None of it ever happened. And I ended up tracking down the author. He was a former history professor up at a university in Michigan. He had since retired, moved to Washington State. I was able to track him down through the internet. I get a hold of him, and I told Bo this story this afternoon. I didn't want to come right out and say, hey, dude, your story's bunk. So I kind of went back and forth, hey, I was reading your story, very interested. He wrote back, well, I'm glad you're interested. Shoot me some questions you might have. And so I wrote back and said, I don't think any of it's true. And shockingly, he writes back, well, you know what? Never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So the big surprise to me was everything people say about checking your resources and your sources for stories is so true. I really wanted to believe this story, and sadly, it wasn't true. We didn't include it, but I really thought it was going to make the Bernhardt story much bigger than it was. It's still a cool story, but that was a surprise. The other, I guess, big surprise for me was I thought I knew a little bit about Tecumseh and his involvement in the different programs or military actions that took place in Northwest Ohio. But I was really surprised to read about his involvement at the Battle of Fort Recovery. And I go into detail on that in the second chapter, and how that particular battle was really the first loss for the Native American Confederation and probably led to their loss at the Battle of Fallen Timbers here in Maumee. And I never made the connection. So that was really a surprise for me, not being an historian, not knowing all the details. And it was fascinating. And I hope people feel the same way when they read the chapter. And then lastly, the other surprising thing that for me, I said I spent a lot of time at the library kind of surfing all the different archives, and in particular, just the only way to get to it is just sit in this room with this microfilm and just going through all these newspapers. And the one thing that just blew me away was just how outrageous the newspapers were in the teens and the 20s in Toledo. These are some slides from a story that was a big story in Toledo in the 20s. There was a person involved in several murders in the Old West End. They called him the Clubber. And apparently he was clubbing women over the head. And these were some of the fiendish, drawings they made and headlines that were there. But even just other side stories, I'm looking up a story about Babe Ruth. There's a side story about a mother who, beat her son to death or whatever it might be. It just, and the way they carried the stories were just a surprise to me. I thought that the media today was kind of out there. And trust me, the media back in those days were just as far out as they are today. So that was kind of a surprise.
Old copies.
Yeah, that's
yeah.
right.
I think the historian in Michigan probably is still upset about the war between Michigan and Ohio, and
that's what it is. Yeah, they got stuck with the UP, and we got Toledo.
Yeah, that's a great looking cover.
Yeah, I'm really pleased with how this all came out. I'm really excited about it.
So what's your next book going to be?
I have 2 projects going on right now. One is done, actually. I signed off on the galleys today, sent it back out. That's going to be done through Reedy Press out of St. Louis, and it's called 100 Things to Do in Toledo Before You Die. I don't make up the title. That's their shtick. They actually have done about 200 of these books around the country, 100 Things to Do in San Francisco, 100 Things to Do in Chicago. And they stumbled onto my website and contacted me early this year and said, look, we think you could write this. What do you want to do? And I put it together. And frankly, I started on it in March and, right in the middle of the COVID thing. And I didn't think it was really going to go off because I didn't know how many of these places were still going to be open. But it's worked out pretty well. I know all the places that are in there are still around, and hopefully will still be around in March when the book gets published. So that will come out in March, and that'll be
great.
sold on Amazon and all the major bookstores. And then I'm working on a third project called Remarkable Spaces, and I'm working with a great photographer here in town. Just moved here recently from Los Angeles. He specializes in architectural photography, and it's called Remarkable Spaces. And essentially, we're selecting 40 to 50 really cool places in the Northwest Ohio area. And he shoots the photos, and I'm writing essays. And we're doing everything from churches to barns to silos to houses to buildings, industrial, whatever, kind of piques our interest in terms of a remarkable space that have an interesting story behind them.
Yeah, I love to see, and this happened to me driving through downtown last weekend. A building came down, but it revealed old advertising on a brick wall of another building, and I thought, wow, I wonder what the story is behind that.
Yeah, that's one I always wanted to do too, is like ghost signs, because there's a lot of them downtown that would make a great story. That's maybe something to put on the list.
All right. Here's a question from the audience. Did you come across stories of people who intended to pass through but stayed?
I did not focus on any of those, but I have a few of my own favorites. There's one in particular. I did a tour that's now online called History and Hops, and it's a story of beer in Toledo. And one of Toledo's beer barons was literally on his way through Toledo, on his way to St. Louis, where all the German brewers were headed. And he went on a hunting trip and fell in love with Toledo. And I can understand why. It's a great story. But that itself could be a cool book, people who were just going to pass through and stayed. And that's really our story. My wife and I moved here 32 years ago and came here from Chicago. I grew up in Mansfield, but had moved to Chicago, and we got recruited to come here, and we thought, we'll be here a couple of years. And 32 years later, we wouldn't leave. We just love it here. It's home, raised our family, and I'm a big fan of the Maumee Valley.
Yeah, Toledo is great. I recently moved from Ann Arbor to here. And I can say Ann Arbor is, in fact, overrated. People say, oh, the food's so good. We have so many more great restaurants in this area, and so many more attractions.
Exactly.
It's really a fantastic place to
Yep.
live. Other questions out there?
I'm going to unmute everybody if you all want to.
All right, great.
Anybody have any questions they want to throw our way?
Yeah, Ted, this is John Ikest. That was great. I really look forward to seeing the book. I just wondered if since you concentrate so much on telling stories, I've heard so many good stories that you've told over the years. Is there any particular story that people think of as a classic Toledo story that actually isn't true?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. I think the one that really comes to mind the most is Al Capone. I don't know how many people have told me, Al Capone used to hang out at Ventura's out on Bancroft. And it's unfortunately just not true. The only evidence we have of Capone ever coming to Toledo was in 1919 when he came for the Dempsey-Willard fight. And he came as Al Brown, believe it or not. What a great undercover name. And I tell that story in the book. And my favorite part of that story was Dempsey's manager let him come into the locker room, and apparently Al Brown or Al Capone cornered two Ohio State boxing officials and was kind of had him in the corner of the room talking to them, and they all scattered off, and someone asked the manager, do you think those guys know that was Al Capone? And he said, I bet they do. They wouldn't take money from someone they don't know. So I think Al Capone's the one story. I've heard people say, oh, he stayed at the Park Lane Hotel, or he had a place on Lake Erie. It's all fanciful. I mean, it sounds like a great story, but it just didn't happen.
Well, thank you.
Yep.
So I will ask a question and answer it, and that is, where can you get yourself a copy of this book? That would be at utoledopress.com, utoledopress.com. We have an e-commerce site. You can purchase the book there.
And I think Gathering Volumes has it as well in Perrysburg, if you want to pick one up.
That is correct. That's our local outlet.
Yep.
They've done a fantastic job with us over the years.
All right. Anybody else have any questions?
Hey, Ted. This is Greg Brackness. I have two questions. One, I thought when I got one of your pre-ordered books, I thought you were going to sign it, and I didn't get it signed, so I was hoping to get that done some point.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. They shipped them out before I had a chance, and by the time I said something, so Greg, let me know, email me, or I've got your contact. I'm happy to sign books for anybody, so
okay.
Happy to do that, but I appreciate it.
Mine too.
The other question I had was how you went about picking the folks that are in this book. Obviously, there was probably a big possibility of choices you could pick, and how did you kind of hone it down to the ones that you did?
It's a great question. I probably had 50 or 60 different stories that I started, and then I had to whittle it down. And I think for me, the key was I really wanted each one of them to have their own backstory. It's one thing to say that, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle came to Toledo, but it's another thing when you find out that he came here because he was totally enamored of a spiritualist who supposedly could hook him up with his dead mother and his brother. And the story behind that is just fascinating. So, there are a lot of great stories, and I do plan on doing a second, maybe even a third volume of this series. But the first 25 or so were picked out primarily because of the backstory that accompanies the visit.
Sounds good.
Bo, I'm going to open you back up and let you kind of finish this off. If you guys have any other questions, text them over and we'll figure out how to answer them. And by all means, if you get a chance, go to holytoledohistory.com. That's holytoledohistory.com. And you can email me, shoot me any questions. If you want to figure out a way for me to sign a book, happy to do it, but that's the best way to get a hold of me. And my email is tlong@holytoledohistory.com. Bo, I'll let you kind of close it out.
Yep. Yeah, it would be great if we weren't in days of COVID and we could have a in-person event, but it is fantastic we were able to do this virtually over Zoom. I'm thankful that all of you showed up here this evening. Ted, I want to thank you for your fantastic work on this volume.
Thank you.
These are amazing stories about an amazing place, and I can't look forward enough to volume 2 coming out. So keep looking at those microfilm reels, which all of us librarians greatly love.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. I really appreciate your support. And like I said, get in touch with me via holytoledohistory.com.
Right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.